If you're a manufacturer that is responsible for that supply chain, would you not just move your supply chain entirely into the US and forget the idea of having to deal with tariffs entirely?
And there's the key to understanding Trump's position. But for its own citizens, it needs more than that, about 20 million barrels a day. Canada produces exactly the kind of heavy crude that American refineries are set up to process, to turn into actually useful things like gas, diesel, jet fuel. So the US buys the majority, around 60% of the additional crude oil it needs from Canada.
The Americans have a cushion. If we have to cut oil, what do we do with the oil? You've taken 90% of Alberta's exports go to the US. So again, you're going to wreck the Alberta economy. You're going to impose all those costs within Alberta.
Probably February 1st is the date we're looking at. We're talking about approximately 25%.
Probably February 1st, approximately 25%, without really any more detail than that. These are threats, not policy. But let's say we take Trump's words at face value, and he orders a 25% across-the-board tariff on all goods coming in from Canada and Mexico. What does that do to the American economy? Well, one study by a Washington think tank suggests two things would happen. Inflation would go up, and GDP would go down.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
When you put a tax on foreign goods, it's not those countries who pay the tax. And here's why. Let's say I have a booming American business in mystery boxes. What's in these boxes? Who knows? Doesn't matter. Maybe it's a Mexican avocado, or it could be a Canadian LX 877 Feller Buncher. You don't know. But for me to sell these mystery boxes to Americans, I have to import them first. And if my cost is $100 a box, a 25% tariff means my business has to pay a 25% tax on every box.
The fee is generally paid by the importer. The importer has to pay the fee to the US government.
But so my other option as a business is to pass my higher costs onto you, the customer.
It will mostly be US consumers or US purchasers of intermediary goods from Canada who will pay the tariffs.
We saw a really interesting example of this inflationary pressure at work in 2018 when Trump put a tariff on washing machines. American researchers did a whole study about this because not only did the cost of imported washing machines go up, LG and Samsung are South Korean, but even American washing machines somehow became more expensive.
You see your competitors putting up their prices because of tariffs, and you are not importing. When they have an opportunity to make money, well, that's what you do.
And here's the kicker. This study also found that the price of dryers, their price went up by a similar magnitude. It didn't matter if you were foreign or domestic. Dryer prices across the board went up by a very noticeable amount in a very small amount of time. Dryers weren't even part of the Trump tariffs in 2018. But because people tend to buy washers and dryers in pairs, businesses charged more money for them too. The logic here is pretty straightforward. When prices go up, consumers have less spending power. More of their money is going to pay this 25% tariff to the government. And that means businesses are taking in less money. Consumer spending accounted for almost 70% of US GDP last year. It is the driver of the American economy.
You say that the average car crosses the border 7 or 8 times, 8, 9 times over the course of its production. Trying to unwind that in a way that doesn't hurt American consumers is an incredibly difficult task. I spoke to one trade analyst in the United States who said, tinkering even a little bit with the fundamentals of that trade organization is like doing surgery without anesthesia.
And consider how some parts manufacturers have plants on both sides of the Canada-US border, and many ship parts between locations constantly. A company like that would have to completely rethink its supply chain, or else face 25% higher costs, sometimes multiple times for the same product.
If you're a manufacturer that is responsible for that supply chain, would you not just move your supply chain entirely into the US and forget the idea of having to deal with tariffs entirely?
And there's the key to understanding Trump's position. Another stated goal of these tariffs is to turn American purchases into American jobs by actually making the things that people usually buy. Tariffs do bring money in to the US Treasury. The estimates I've seen from what Trump has proposed are in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's money that can fund the military, border control, tax cuts, whatever Republicans want. But long before any of that happens, countries like Canada suffer greatly. Back to that chart showing the drop in American GDP. For whatever hit their economy takes, the Canadian and Mexican economies are projected to get hit 5-10 times as hard. Because a country like Canada relies much more on the US than the US relies on Canada.
78% of our exports go to the United States. So if those exports are suddenly 25% more expensive, then Americans aren't going to buy them. Or they may buy what they need, but they're going to buy significantly less.
So there are some estimates that believe Canada will fare even worse than the scenario I just showed you, that even a more modest 10% tariff would cause Canadian GDP to fall more than 2 percentage points, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but on $2 trillion of GDP, 2% is $40 billion. That's more than what Canada has typically spent annually on its entire national defense budget. Up the tariff to 25%, and the damage gets even worse.
Weaponized uncertainty instills fear into foreign investors, and it also instills fear into Canadian companies that maybe I need to move that plant expansion to the other side of the border.
And let's consider the auto industry once again. Vehicles are Canada's second largest export by value at $51 billion annually. The overwhelming majority of that, 93% of all those cars and trucks, go to the United States.
So the US and Canada have an average tariff rate now of less than 5%. Quintupling that is just unimaginable. Canada is in a real bind if it can no longer trade effectively with the United States.
And this is where we really start entering into wildly speculative, uncharted waters. Because while cars are Canada's number 2 export to the United States, you know what the number 1 export is? Oil. The US produces more crude oil than any other country in the world, around 13 million barrels a day. But for its own citizens, it needs more than that, about 20 million barrels a day. Canada produces exactly the kind of heavy crude that American refineries are set up to process, to turn into actually useful things like gas, diesel, jet fuel. So the US buys the majority, around 60% of the additional crude oil it needs from Canada. Sourcing this oil from Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, that is politically, economically, and logistically far more difficult. A 25% tariff would hurt Americans. But if Canada retaliates hard and takes the so-called nuclear option, slapping down its own export tariffs on Canadian oil or banning its export to the United States entirely,
the Americans have a cushion. If we have to cut oil, what do we do with the oil? You've taken 90% of Alberta's exports go to the US. So again, you're going to wreck the Alberta economy. You're going to impose all those costs within Alberta. And for what?
Bottom line, trade wars are messy and also hard to forecast because all of this is just the beginning.
You know the story about killing chickens to scare monkeys? A farmer will take a chicken into the courtyard and kill it so the monkeys watch and get the idea. We're kind of the chicken in that scenario.
Donald Trump's stated ambition is to fundamentally reshape the U.S. trade relationship, not just with Canada, but with the entire world. In his words, the U.S. is being ripped off by everybody. So, as president, he's looking to change that.